Alistair, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you. Pleasure to join you all again. I see quite a lot of friendly faces in the crowd, which is great. So good to see you all. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation this evening, Johnny. Thank you.
Fantastic. And yeah, I guess the best place to start is always my favorite starting question is, how did you find yourself in the wonderful world of startups and scaling businesses?
Yeah, well, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I was a research scientist. It's a long time ago. So was working in a lab doing scientific research, but fairly quickly moved from that into doing IT-related things, software. And so the bulk of my career has been in the software space, initially in larger corporate environments and in the pharmaceuticals and the utility sectors. But then in year 2000, I decided to run away and join the circus and took a job with a dot-com startup, which was a lot of fun for a very short period of time.
I hear the year 2000 was a perfect time to join a dot-com startup, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Timing is everything. Yeah. I think we've got a little bit more on the money with the timing for the Scottish Tech Army, but we'll get to that. So yeah, that was a short-lived foray into the early stage world, but it really gave me an interesting view into what was a very different kind of business environment. So although that business didn't succeed, I was very much convinced that I didn't want to go back into a larger corporate world. And so since then, 2001 onwards, I've been involved in the world of early stage and scaling software companies. So that was the initial intro. And the business that you're referring to that we ultimately took to exit, that was 2004. So in between those two periods, I was involved with a number of other startup businesses, and some of which are still going. And yeah, just gained a lot of experience that helped me to take that forward into the business I've been involved in since then.
Very good. And let's start back at that sort of period of time. Like whenever you started the initial .com, realized or became early in this original .com company, realized that perhaps the heavy corporate environment wasn't perhaps for you anymore, and the startup world was it. What was this? What was that uncertain period like for the first 2-3 years before you really got behind this great company in 2004?
It was lots of fun actually, and that was the hallmark of what had motivated me to stay in the early stage environment to start with. Really, because there's obviously lots of challenges around early stage businesses, in that you typically don't have a brand and you don't have necessarily a fully developed product, but the opportunity to really be in control of your own destiny, to build a team that is really motivated, really passionate, and committed to the same goal. That was really exciting. And so the original .com business that went into administration did actually get bought out by another company, so I spent a bit of time with them. But then moved on and was involved with 2 or 3 other businesses around about the same sort of time, before deciding to mainstream on the business Hand-Dog Technology, as it was then, which was the one that I spent that period of time in.
And how many employees did Hand-Dog have when you first joined, and then how did it scale while you were there?
Well, it was the archetypal 2 guys in a crappy office up the top end of Dundee. So myself and another guy. So he had also had a foray into the .com world, which had ended every bit as well as mine. And so he had ideas about starting another business, and so he was from a product marketing background, so more commercial, and he was looking to find somebody who came from a technical background who could work together on the idea. So he had initially started the business up with someone who decided to move on, and he and I were introduced by a mutual contact. And I thought the idea was really interesting and promising, and so we decided between the 2 of us that we would give it a go. So it was literally just 2 of us at that point. And the experiences that we'd had in the .com environment definitely shaped the way that we went about developing that business, because in 2000 and the years leading up to that, it's a very different environment. You had to spend a lot of money on equipment. You had to put it in a data center. You had to incur lots of costs before you could even start trying to do any business. before we had any customers. But even those, 4 years later, it was a very different environment. And we started up the business working on a server that we rented for £29 a month. And we were determined to bootstrap the business because, we wanted to do it a different way. And so that was the starting point was the two of us. I guess about 9 months in was when we started to look at potentially bringing some other people on board. So to start with, it was the two of us, and both of us driving around all over the country trying to find customers who might want to buy the product. So we kept it pretty lean, and the original exit of the business was 5 years later in 2009, and at that point we had 35 people. So still, reasonably lean, and the business was acquired by a larger software company based in Malta, of all places. And I decided to just get on with the acquiring company. My co-founder decided he was going to step out and do other things at that point. So at that stage, I took on a role as general manager of the division of that company that had been created out of our business and another one that they'd acquired. And for me, that was a transition point from having been in primarily technical roles, so CTO type roles, into a more general business, general management type environment with P&L responsibility. So that was a huge kind of learning curve and experience for me as well. So that's where we got to at that point.
Okay, yeah. And as the company scaled from 3 to 30, and then obviously acquired and becomes much larger, what's different between each type of company, and how scalable is the culture, and what would you recommend around maintaining it?
Well, that's a really key question. And so in the early days, when there's 2 or 3 people, obviously, everybody's pretty much doing a bit of everything. Whatever needs to be done, whether that's trying to pitch to customers, or it's figure out how to build the product, or it's taking support calls at all sorts of hours of the day and night when things didn't go quite right. So it's very, I guess, chaotic in that sense. It's very reactive. So we obviously had a vision of what we're trying to achieve, but as everybody who's been involved in these things knows, it's not a straight line by any means. So that was, at the outset, that's the situation. Once you get above maybe 10 to 15 people, you start getting people who have their own areas of responsibility. So you might have somebody who's heading up sales or heading up marketing. And that's quite a key transition point, because that's the point at which, the founders are no longer directly managing everybody in the company. But, it's still pretty compact, still pretty lean structure. So right up to the point where we got to that point of having 35 people, we were all in the same office. We all knew each other really well. So most of the hiring had been done by the founders. So there's quite a strong selection filter on the way in for people joining the company. So, if they're not going to be a cultural fit, most times you can kind of sense that in the interview process. Sometimes you make a mistake, but it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly. And, either the person decides for themselves it's not right for them, or the organization has a kind of allergic reaction and expels them. So it's, I wouldn't say culture takes care of itself, but, it's all within direct line of sight. So it's pretty immediate, and any issues that might be arising, it's easy to spot them and easy to deal with them. So one of the biggest transitions, obviously, is if you start owning up other offices or other locations. For a lot of early stage companies, that might happen when they decide to start doing business internationally. And it's interesting to look at the different approaches that companies take to doing business internationally. So the first market that we decided to try and launch in was in North America. And that was within about 18 months of starting. So it was quite early. And you'll often hear people say that the ideal scenario is if one of the founders goes out and spearheads the international growth. So that wasn't the approach we took, but we did the next best thing, which is we hired my co-founder's brother-in-law, who was in Canada. And he was obviously very well known to us and close to us. So,
Yep.
It took a lot of the risk out of, that first hire in another country, because that can be a very difficult thing, especially, in a sales environment. Again, it's quite cliched, but, salespeople are generally very good at selling themselves. They may not always be quite as good at selling the product. So it's easy to make a mistake.
Yeah.
But, we were kind of insulated against that because this is somebody who was known to us. So that certainly helped. And also, as we started to build out a small team there, that helped us to maintain that culture. We did, annually, we had an all hands company meeting, and we flew everybody across so that, we'd spend a weekend together. We'd go off into a house in the country and, just do stuff together, combination of business and leisure. So, that all helped. So that was all, within that sort of period.
Yeah.
You get to further down the line. I mean, one thing that really brought it home to me was that we had acquired a company that was based in the Netherlands and had an engineering office in Belarus. It's in the news at the moment, so in Minsk. So I've been in the square where they're all protesting. Huh. And I was across in the office in Minsk and meeting with the team there. And I was sitting in one of the meeting rooms, and it was a completely white room. And I thought, this doesn't feel like our company. This could be any company. It has no personality of our company whatsoever, and it just doesn't feel part of it. Yeah. So, how are we going to actually make them feel part of the same organization? How are we going to get some common values, some common culture? But actually, as I sat there, I thought to myself, do you know what? If I go back to our office in Dundee, it's not all white. It's got a bit more bright colors, but actually, there's not really much visible identity of the company there. Mm-hmm. And so, by that time, we had about 10 offices around the world, and we went through a very deliberate process of being much more consistent about how we styled the offices, how we decorated them. We made a big play on, and it's often viewed as a bit kind of cheesy or corny to have, stuff painted on the walls, the values and all that sort of thing. But the impact it had was, when somebody came from one of the offices to the office here or vice versa, suddenly when they walk in there, it feels like this is our company. These are my colleagues, and it does make a difference. So it definitely has to be something you're very much more deliberate and conscious about when you get to that sort of stage. So it does go through those stages. But at every point there's new challenges, but that's part of the fun as well.
Yeah, new challenges, new things to learn. I think the interesting thing you point out there is, at least for many of our early stage founders in the audience today, when it's scaling, the first 2, 3, 5, 10 hires are so important for what will then become the overall company culture. So how did you approach them? You said you're very particular about your hiring process. What were some of the things you looked for in your employees to make sure that this culture was maintained?
Yeah, so I think at that early stage, people have to have quite a high tolerance of ambiguity. So in larger organizations, roles are much more tightly defined. People are given a very clear remit as to what they're supposed to do. In earlier stage companies, that tends much less to be the case. So you've got to have some idea that people are reasonably comfortable with quite fluid situations, and the fact that although the strategy might not change, the tactics can change quite often, quite quickly. And so they need to be comfortable with the fact that just because we're changing direction doesn't mean to say we've lost our way or what we're doing is necessarily wrong at the time. But that level of comfort with that level of change is really important. And so you can kind of get a sense of that for, the way people talk about what they do in their personal lives as well. Somebody who, well, we always go on a holiday here and we always go out for dinner there and that sort of thing. Yeah. It's not indicative of somebody who has that kind of mindset. I think one of the things that's really, really important, and you see it time and time again, is that people have got to be self-starter types. Especially if you're hiring at senior level, because, time and time again, you see in early stage companies, they get to a certain stage, and especially if they have external investment, they're told, right, you need to go and hire a grown up to run this now, be that sales or whatever else it is. And the number of times that I've seen that fail, far exceeds the number of times it's been successful, because it's really hard for people who, they may have done that earlier in their career, but it's really hard if you got to the point where you've been used to operating with a team, with a brand, with funding, with a distribution network and all that sort of thing, to go back to having none of that. And so, it's a very seductive trap to say we need somebody who's, been through all the stages that we're going to go through. So I think hiring, appropriate for the next stage you're going to get to is sound, but not kind of trying to jump too many levels ahead.
Yeah, it's very tempting to jump all around myself right now and jump in, because this is a nice transition to Scottish Tech Army and you're restarting without that established brand. But I think we'll try and keep some structure to the conversation. And I'll bounce onto another one that I think it's always important, whenever I have founder discussions and these sort of things. Can you name a few occasions when you're building up this business or any of your business, that things just went wrong or looked like they weren't quite going to work out? What were some of the tough lessons you were forced to learn from those kind of things?
Sure. I think that tends to change as well, depending on the stage. Okay. So in the early days, a lot of that might be product related, because, the product's still quite immature. You don't have a robust testing infrastructure. You're not doing things like load testing and stress testing. You're just trying to get features out the door. So a lot of the early risk is product risk. So I clearly remember one occasion when I was driving back from being in a meeting somewhere, and one of our very early customers phoned me up, and the way we configured the system, what it did was to monitor IT systems that IT service companies were looking after, and we give them alerts and warnings about things that were wrong and that sort of thing. And we'd set the system up to generate these alerts. What we hadn't done was set it up such that once it had notified you about an alert, it wouldn't tell you about it again unless it recurred. So this guy phoned me up and he said, "Please make it stop. It's sending me a message every 5 minutes. I'm being driven out of my mind here." So, that was one of these occasions when you literally have to stop, get in the lay-by, get the laptop out and try and fix it on the fly. So, that's the kind of thing that tends to happen in the early stages. As things move on, in our case, we didn't take external investment, so we didn't really tend to run into this problem so much. But, for many early stage companies, running out of money is clearly one of the existential crisis moments that they have. Now, we were in the position that wasn't so much of an issue because we decided to bootstrap the business. But, that's one of the ones that in an early stage company, if you've taken investment and you're running out of money, is a real big crisis in the company. It's unfortunately, it's relatively common that people don't act quickly enough in that situation. They've set out a plan to investors and they just stick to the plan, even though it isn't working. And it's too tempting just to say, well, we just need to stick with it. It'll come right. And all too often, unfortunately, it doesn't. So that's certainly one of the challenges that companies face. Coming back to hiring is another one. If you've made a mistake in hiring, that can be very damaging and debilitating within the company. So like every company, we did have some of those hiring mistakes. Some of them, were pretty obvious pretty quickly. Some of them it took longer to get to grips with them. So hiring and people issues is one that can be a big challenge. I think it's also another kind of transition point for companies is when they start to work with a distribution network, with distribution partners. I've used this slide before, which when we were doing presentations, that people who are doing this for the first time, they tend to think that a partner is somebody who's going to help accelerate their growth, and ultimately that should be the case. So their view is that they're at the bottom of the mountain, these guys are at the top of the mountain, they're going to help them up. Actually, it's the other way around when you first start, and so there's some hard lessons sometimes to be learned about the value, but also the pitfalls of working with partners. So, those are just some examples of some of the challenges that you might face.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, a few, but some of many that will continue to pop up on the startup journey. I guess that's part of the fun. You mentioned something that I think is really interesting. It's the idea that you bootstrap this business, maintained profitability. It's a very strong way to grow your business, and make sure that it's actually self-sustaining. You then, grew the business as it was acquired, and then began to invest yourself and also start to get involved in external funding. So how do you feel about taking external investment overall now, having been almost both sides of the journey, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just as a kind of a little aside to that, it was quite an interesting experience going through that process of the first acquisition, because we had to unlearn the behaviors that we'd learned that had got us to where we were, because we had bootstrapped the company, we kept it pretty lean in terms of expenditure, in terms of hiring. And once that happened, we suddenly were part of a bigger organization. It was backed by a New York-based VC, so we had access to capital. We had to unlearn that and learn, if you like, the ways in which to put that money to work. So, that was a definite change for us, because we'd been taking a fairly conservative path, I guess you might say, in many ways. But it was when we got our heads around the fact that, we had a proven model, we had access to resources, and we really could start to scale, that it really started to take off. So in the year after that initial acquisition, we did $6 million in revenue. That was in 2010. By 2014, we were doing 60 million. So, you definitely see the impact of access to resources in order to accelerate growth. So, nowadays, I think, first of all, there are certain companies that are suitable for venture capital and some that are not. And I don't think there's necessarily that good an understanding of which companies are appropriate for venture capital funding. I think there's this kind of default assumption that any early stage business should go out and try and raise money. And I don't think that's always the case. However, I think, there's no question that if you do have access to capital and you use it well, you will undoubtedly grow faster. I mean, that's the whole point, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the key thing is to, first of all, I would say, you need to get to a certain point before you raise that money. Again, at various points in time, there's been, the apocryphal stories of people raising tens of millions on the back of a PowerPoint deck. And I dare say that has happened from time to time, but not many of them have done well. So I think, to me, and certainly as an investor, you need a certain amount of evidence to back up the fact that, you've got a market that's going to be big enough, that you've got an idea that's sufficiently differentiated, that you've got a team that can deliver on it. So, the typical things that VCs will look for in evaluating an investment pitch. And so, again, you get investors that go in at different stages. You get angel and seed stage investors who will go in much earlier than some others, and they're more comfortable with the risk because the return is potentially a lot bigger for them in terms of multiples. But I think, there's a danger, a trap in getting hooked on the crack cocaine of VC money, and thinking that you always have to be raising. The time to be raising is when you've proved you've made progress, not because you're running out of money.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you're running out of money because it isn't working, adding more money is probably not going to solve it. You've got a bigger problem than that. Yeah,
I think that lesson is absolutely fantastic. I was going to actually ask you now about some of your investment philosophies, what you maybe look for either as an angel or whenever you're in a full stage VC as investment director. What are some of the things you look for? Is it companies that are at that stage? And what are some of the things you consider?
Sure. Well, for me, I only tend to look at investments in areas that I have experience in. So B2C businesses, I don't know enough about them to be able to evaluate them well. So that's a very obvious filter for me. I think, the typical things that investors are looking for, first of all is, can you build a really sizable business out of this? So what is the market? And, there's a difference between the market you start off in and the market you can ultimately reach. And so even if your target market initially is relatively small, if you have a credible path to getting from there to a much bigger market, that I think is fine. And I dare say many of the people on this call will have read Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, in which he talks about that, that in the early days, the best approach is to get into as narrow a niche as you can, because you can be differentiated, you can potentially dominate that niche. As long as you then have a mechanism, you can go to a much bigger market. So ultimately being able to get into that bigger market is going to be really important. I think the next thing then is, what is the product idea? What is it that's different about what you're going to do compared to what's already on the market? And this is one of the areas that I would say is most commonly done poorly in pitch decks is competitive analysis. The number of pitches that come in that you see saying, well, we're unique, we have no competition, and 5 minutes on Google and they're wrong.
Yeah. So
that's a real turnoff for an investor, because it just says, you haven't really done your homework, you don't know what you're up against, so how can you possibly win? So a really good understanding of the market and how you're going to differentiate and what's going to make your product successful against either incumbents, or if it's a new market, how you're going to be able to convince people that your product is worth using. So that's certainly a second area, is the product, how it stacks up against competition. The people aspect of it is clearly ultra important. You'll hear it said many times, investors back founders, they back teams.
Yeah.
And so getting a level of confidence about the first of all, they call it founder market fit as well as product market fit. So what do you know about the market that makes what's your unfair advantage, if you like, in that market? Have you operated in that market before, or have you got an insight from another market that you're taking to that market that means that you are the people who are uniquely qualified to do this?
Yep.
So that's a really key part as well. I think finally, assuming you're going to be successful, how are you going to be able to defend your market position? So what's your competitive differentiation going to be, and how can you sustain it? Because something that gets off the ground does really well, but is easily copied, or suffers some really high churn. Those are the things that ultimately are going to cause a business to fail. So I think those would be some of the key areas I think that people will be looking at as investments.
Yeah, and great advice for all the people that we have watching along right now as well. In your own philosophy, or in your own way of thinking, how do you feel about the venture capital model of effectively home run or bust, as opposed to perhaps a 3 or 4x, you want a 10, 20, 100, 1000x? And how do you feel about get big or die?
Indeed. Different investors have different views on that. I think if you take a probabilistic approach, the number of companies that do get to that stage is tiny, and the reason you hear so much about them is because they are so few in number. So if you're going to do that, you need to have really deep pockets, because you're going to have to sink a ton of money into something that may or may not work. So I think that's appropriate for well-established funds who have got large pools of capital at their disposal. If you're looking at earlier sort of seed stage, Series A type investors, they're going to take a slightly different view. By and large, they're going to try and spread their exposure, or their risk exposure, a bit more. I've not been part of a business that's raised tens of millions and tried that, so I don't have personal experience of doing that. But it's fascinating. I mean, they say if you can raise money, then do. But there was an example last week of a company that is in a competitive space with one of the companies that I'm involved with. They raised about 60 million less than a year ago, and they've just raised another 200 million.
Cool.
And they said, well, we raised it because the money was on the table. We haven't actually spent the last lot of money yet. It's still in the bank. So I'm not quite sure I understand the logic behind that. I think we're definitely, seeing a bit of a correction in the market in the last 6 to 9 months. I think it definitely was growth at all costs.
Oh, yeah.
For many investors at every stage, almost really. You've got to go flat out. You've got to really chase top line growth at the expense of everything else. I would say there's definitely been a shift in market sentiment. There's more of a return to, absolutely we want growth, but we need to understand what the unit economics of these customers are. So, how viable is this? Companies that have raised hundreds of millions and still can't make a profit out of any customer, I think, they're finding it a lot tougher now. So I think, there's a bit more of what I would see as balance returning to the market. The last couple of years, the market has been very overheated, and there's been so much money looking for a good home that it's been relatively easy to raise large amounts of money. That's not the case now, I wouldn't say. To the extent that I would say, there were certainly companies, and I would include some in the Scottish ecosystem that, I actually don't think ever should have been funded. I think, investors were chasing a relatively small number of deals, and they're going into deals that perhaps they shouldn't have, to be honest.
Yeah, and with that in mind, actually, in the final point, how do we continue to promote and create a larger number of good deals coming through the ecosystem, so that, as you say, there is, or at least up until this point has been, a lot of money on the market, perhaps not in the Scottish ecosystem. There's a conversation to have around that as well. But yeah, the money's there in America and in London, that sort of thing. So what can we do to promote a greater number of great businesses coming up through the ranks that really do deserve to be funded?
Well, I think it's fascinating in that actually recessions are when some great companies get founded. And it can be all sorts of reasons. It can be that a new market opportunity opens up. It can be as simple as, someone's lost their job and they decide, well, I'm going to give this a go. But in any big economic shock, so it's the same in the financial crisis as it is now, 2008 and 2009, opportunities do open themselves up. And actually, we were in a fortunate position that we benefited from the 2008 and 2009 recession, in fact, because the product that we sold was to allow IT services companies to serve their customers. And this was in the SME market. And when the recession hit, lots of companies were looking to cut costs, reduce headcount. So they actually tended to outsource their IT more rather than less. So if you were an IT services company at that point, it was quite a good time to be in business because there was more business available to you. And because they were our customers, we found that we were actually benefiting from that as well. So I think market sentiment and market conditions change, and the really good entrepreneurs are the ones that are sensitive to that and are reforming the strategies based on what they currently see. So as an example, if you looked at the situation of about a year ago, the messaging that resonated with customers was typically all about, we can help you make more money, we can help you grow. Again, coming back to that, it's all about growth mentality. So messaging around growing revenue was about twice as effective as messaging around saving costs. Well, that's completely flipped on its head now. And so messaging around saving costs is about three times more effective than messaging about making more money. So being agile in terms of understanding what your market looks like is really important. Looking at the kind of broader question of what does it take to create great companies and to scale them, I think this kind of environment, it really sorts out the really good entrepreneurs, the ones who can do that. And I think for those ones, they'll be in a good position to raise money because there is still actually a huge amount of money in funds that they're looking to put to work. There's the public markets have gone down a lot. So, it's really hard to make a return on public markets. Property markets very stagnant. Interest rates are zero basically. So there's still a lot of money that's available to go into venture and PE type investments. To your point about access to capital for companies in Scotland, I know from talking to them that quite a number of the angel syndicates have actually been pretty active during the last 3 months while the pandemic's been in place. Now, a lot of that's been follow-on investments into existing companies, but they are also doing new deals. And I think Scotland is well supplied in the seed stage investment community.
Yeah,
there's a bit of a gap opening up at the bottom of that, because most of the early stage angel syndicates have started doing bigger deals. So there is a bit of a gap at the bottom. There's then quite a strong supply in the, if you want to raise 500K to $1.5 million, there's quite a lot of capital available to do that. But then when you get beyond that, you do still get back into the situation where there are not many investment groups in Scotland that can do that. And I think it's something that a number of the London-based firms, certainly up until recently, they were looking much more actively at deals outside London. So the firm I worked for, Mercia Asset Management, that was based in the Midlands of England. Its strategy was very much around investing in the regions of the UK, including Scotland. And we had lots of conversations with London-based investors who were really keen to be able to sort of deal flow from outside London, because pricing of deals is a lot better, competition's a lot lower. So there is an appetite amongst London investors to look outside London, but frankly, they're quite lazy about it most of the time. So they generally don't put much effort into coming to try and find it, and so it's very much incumbent on companies and their existing investors to go find that money. And you can certainly raise money in London as a Scottish-based company, but you're going to have to do a lot more legwork, because they're not going to just trip over you. So I think that's something that we haven't yet learned in Scotland, is how to,
as you say, I think that's not just a London thing as well, at least from conversations I've heard with Silicon Valley-based investors, perhaps changing now as the world becomes more, it becomes easier to access someone. For example, I'm talking from Scotland. I do my job from London. You yourself are talking from, you're in Edinburgh at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah.
So so the joys, we're becoming more connected, but even so, as you say, there's always that kind of threat. The final question we'll do on fundraising, and then we'll jump into what I know a lot of people are here for, as well as the Scottish Tech Army. For the early stage investors looking for these perhaps active angel syndicates, what are the best ways of approaching? Is it warm intros still, or are there different ways of going about it? How would you recommend?
Yeah, well, if you can get a warm intro, then absolutely, that's still very much one of the ways to do it. I think in some ways, the way to approach investors, I would say, it's kind of similar to the way you should look for a job. And if you're looking for a job and you send your CV blind to 50 companies with a cursory covering letter, you're pretty unlikely to be very successful. Certainly when I've been hiring people, what stands out is somebody who's really researched your company. They know what your company does. They know why they're an asset to your company. They tell you why they are. They demonstrate an understanding. I see you just won a big contract with so-and-so. Yeah, I've got contacts in a company like that, that sort of thing. And it's exactly the same with investment pitches to investors. If you put angel investor in your bio in LinkedIn, you get loads of emails, right?
Yeah.
And the stuff that comes through, the variability is enormous. So you get people who have clearly done some research. They know some of the companies you've been involved with. They've got some points of reference. They can explain why they think it's a good fit. Because especially with angel investing, there's very much that early relationship. It's not just the money; it's the personal relationship as well. It's really important.
Yeah.
Most angels want to be able to help the companies, and they want to be able to get involved. So if you can give some credible reason as to why there's a really good fit, why you're a good investor for them, why they're a good investment for you, then that's going to stand out. So I would really recommend researching what other companies have got in their portfolios, for example. So if they've already got an investment in the space, they're probably not going to invest in you, and the fact you haven't even figured that out doesn't say very much about you. If you go into somebody and you're very much a B2C play, and all their investments are in B2B, again, you're just wasting your time. So it's kind of like any sales, I guess. The more you can understand the customer you're trying to sell to, and the more effectively you can craft and hone your pitch to them, the more successful you're likely to be. So do your homework is the short version, I guess.
And that absolutely makes sense. I think we'll now move on to mobilizing, the next chapter, for like mobilizing tech for good and strong, bringing together this great community of which I see many faces from within the STA. How was how was it to set up? We kind of talked a little bit about going from having all the resource and everything to going without a brand name, without the presence. What was that first month or two like, getting everything off the ground?
Honestly, it was amazing. So myself and my co-founder, Peter, we've both been active in early stage businesses for 20 years or more. And neither of us have ever experienced something like this. So the original concept, so I'm sitting here in Edinburgh, and the original concept came about 100 yards down the road. It was early in lockdown. I was out for my daily hour of exercise, having a walk, and coming along the street in the other direction was a guy I know who runs an IT services company in Edinburgh. So started chatting with him about how this was all affecting him. And he was saying that they do a lot of work in the public sector, and the projects that they had in flight were all pretty much carrying on as before, because their client in the public sector still wanted the work done. They wanted to continue to support their suppliers by paying the bills. So that was all fine. But the problem they were really having was that it was almost impossible to get anybody to talk about doing something new, because all their attention was focused on the crisis that was emerging all around them. And so that's what triggered the thought for me initially that the CivTech organisation within Scottish Government was set up to be the vehicle to bring innovation into the public sector. So maybe there was some opportunity there to talk to them about this. The other thing that happened was that the furlough scheme had just been announced, and it was clear there were going to be lots of people in the tech sector who were no longer able to do the jobs that they've been doing for however long it was. They'd be used to working in a team, working on projects or products, delivering things for customers, and suddenly that was going to be taken away overnight. So you put those two things together, and that was where the idea came up of there's going to be lots of demand out there. There's lots of problems that are occurring, and there's going to be lots of people in the tech sector who are suddenly, at a bit of a loss because they can't do their regular job. We can't all go out and become doctors and nurses next week, but we have skills that can help those who are in the front line. So that was where the initial genesis of it came from. So that was in early April, and from that point to launch was about 3 weeks. So in that time, we set up the company. We got all the infrastructure in place. We phoned up some people we knew. I see Helen on the call here who designed the logo for us. She did that literally overnight because she bought into what we're trying to do. Same with Hodgson Roof, who did the PR for us. They wrote the press release overnight for us because they were really enthusiastic about it. So the level of enthusiasm that we saw from people really early on was what gave us confidence that there was something happening here. So get to 28th of April, which is when we launched, and we had put quite a lot of effort into preparing the ground, if you like. So we'd pulled together a list of about 150 people who, contacts of ours in the tech world, in the business world, in the investment world, and primed them to say, look, this is coming on the 28th. We'd really like you to help us publicize it. And then, the day before, we sent another email to them all saying, tomorrow's the big day, don't forget. And then at 10 o'clock, we sent them all an email saying it's go time. It's on the wires, get it out there. And it was unbelievable, the response that we had. And the net effect was that by the end of that day, we had about 150 volunteers signed up. And so, that was amazing, actually. It was really fantastic to see the way people jumped in, stepped forward straight away, no hesitation. I want to help. What can I do? And so that was really the start of it. So, the volunteer side of it exploded instantly, pretty much. The other side of it clearly is making sure that we have worthwhile projects for them to work on. So the other side of it was trying to identify organizations and encourage them to come forward to say, we've got this problem. We're not sure how we can solve it. Can you help? And so the stimulation of project demand was the other key side of it. So again, as much of that as possible, we were doing that through social media, through online tools that meant that we could get reach. We had really good coverage in the offline media as well. So, you know, the PR activity was really so powerful and effective alongside the online stuff. And so, you know, within 3 weeks or so, we had about 35 project ideas that had come to us. So, you know, we got reasonably rapid feedback as well that, you know, there were people out there who were looking for that kind of help. So
yeah,
that effectively validated the hypothesis, if you like. So that was the kind of initial few weeks of it.
Yeah. And then from that initial few weeks, you have this early traction, you have these people signed up and a few ideas. What was it like to try and put, you know, make sure it runs as an organization? It's quite hard to go from 0 to literally 100 plus in that short of time period. So what was it like putting the structures in place?
Well, it's kind of wild ride, I think. So, you know, we coined the expression fairly early on that we were basically building the plane while it was in the air. And so again, it comes back to this thing about, you know, people have to be able to cope with the fact that it's a very fluid situation. This is not an organization that's got a lot of processes battened down, that it's all been tested and proven. And that was where it was just incredible to see the way that people reacted, the way that people jumped in, you know, I think this needs to be done. I'll do it. You know, can I help? So there were certain things that, you know, we kind of deliberately set out to do, and others that just the power of the community made it happen, that people identified a need and stepped forward to fill that need. You know, amongst the things that we deliberately set out to do, we had, as part of our planning, contacted one of the recruitment firms here in Edinburgh, head resourcing, because it was clear to us that if this worked, one of the problems we were going to have was how do we match people to projects? So the head team were, again, phenomenal support to us. They had made a number of their consultants, they'd put them on furlough. So they were in a similar situation to a lot of people in the tech army. So they went out to them and said, would any of you be up for volunteering to work with the Scottish Tech Army? And again, the reaction from them was just amazing. So we had a team of about half a dozen volunteers from Head, and, you know, who knows about matching people to job requirements? Recruiters. So, you know, they were a huge asset to us. And so that was one of the more deliberate aspects. And, you know, that team is still working with us today. You know, I had a call this afternoon with Lisa, who's heading that team up for most of the time. You know, she's unbelievable level of commitment. But, you know, there are whole areas that, you know, we hadn't got right to thinking about, in all honesty. So things like privacy and data protection, we know it's important, right? But it wasn't the first thing we set out to figure out.
I mean, naturally,
and some people, you know, stepped in and said, look, this is really important. I've got experience in this area. Let me help you. Let me do this. And so that upsurge of enthusiasm, commitment, you know, people just taking responsibility for things and making things happen has been absolutely fundamental to what we've seen. And, you know, this is a community, we've now got over 1,000 people in it. These are people who, by and large, they've never met. They don't know each other. They can't meet right now. So it's all done online. And the spirit of community that we've seen developing is unlike anything I've ever seen, especially in the timeframes we're talking about. And again, I'm chatting about it today, and those of you who are in the tech army will have experienced this. We use Slack as the main communications platform that we use. And we tried out fairly early on. There's this little Slack app that some of you will have used, I'm sure, called Donut. And basically what that does is if you sign up, if you join this channel, it just matches you up with 3 other people randomly twice a week and says, why don't you have a call? And that's such a simple little gimmick, if you like, but it was amazing the impact it had, because it really acted as a way to bring all these people in the community together. Because, you know, if you were to sit down and think, right, you know, out of these hundreds of people, who should I speak to? You know, who should I get in touch with? You know, it's quite daunting. and especially, if you're not necessarily that confident or outgoing, just as your personality doesn't feel comfortable with that, then it's really hard. But the barrier to entry was so low, it meant that people really got to know each other, and it was, for such a simple gimmick, it was amazing. And I'm looking at my screen, one of my colleagues in the tech army, Andrew, who was on a donut call with 3 other people, which led to the creation of the in-house band for the tech army, the White Stripe Donuts, who put together a video and a soundtrack and launched it to great fanfare within the army. And so, all sorts of stuff happened like that. And that was a tremendous aid to cohesion. And so the level of engagement we've seen as a result of that has been phenomenal.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen it myself from internally and externally, some of the great stuff being done. Perhaps you'd even share like a story or two of some of the good stuff that's happened since effectively people in the Scottish community came together, obviously from all over, not just Scotland, but we, since we came together to build or do tech for good, I guess is calling it.
Absolutely. Well, there's a number of different aspects to that. So one of them is that community thing, because at the outset, one of the things that we were trying to help tackle was the fact that because people were suddenly being, excluded from what they would normally do, there's a big danger that people would feel a bit disoriented, that the structure and the purpose that they've been used to having in their day is no longer there. Some people might be living on their own, they might be feeling quite isolated. So, that community piece has been a really important part of it. Second one clearly is some of the projects that we've been able to carry out. So nowadays we've had more than 250 projects that have been submitted to us, of which more than half, we've initiated or we're doing or we've done. And that's across a really wide range of organizations. So we've got some that are from Scottish Government at one end of the spectrum to, the Government Community Project, which is a really small charity in Glasgow that supports refugees in Glasgow. So a huge range of different sizes of organization. But for each and every one of them, the volunteers have been able to do something that has really transformed what they're doing. And that's such an amazing thing to see. We've got some video case studies and that sort of thing, of some of the impact that these projects have had on these organizations who, they've either been struggling because the demand for their service has escalated, and they're struggling to cope, or they're typically used to doing things face-to-face in delivering services, and they can't do that anymore, but they're not set up to do it remotely. So there's a whole range of different things like that. There's lots of examples of small charities that have got problems that we can solve relatively quickly, in a few days, that really mean that they can do what they need to do. And so to hear the stories from them of the fact that, they can continue to deliver the services that they've set out to, the benefits they're delivering to all the people that they're serving, has been tremendous. You kind of go a bit further up the scale in terms of size of projects. It's been, one example I would give you is, it's an organisation in Aberdeen called Voluntary Services Aberdeen, who contacted us pretty early on, and they have a little over 20 sites where they deliver services in and around Aberdeen. And they had, quite early on in the crisis, they've been quite forward thinking in terms of making sure that they had enough personal protective equipment to make sure that they could continue to operate safely. But the problem they were having was that they were trying to do it all in a spreadsheet. And of course, that's a nightmare. So they came to us to say, could you help us put a solution in place that means that we can manage this and we can make sure that we've got the right equipment to the right people at the right time, that we're not going to run out. And that was a tremendous project, because we had a team of half a dozen or so people for most of that time, over the course of 6 weeks or so. The people from the charity were completely engaged in the project. It was a tremendous team effort between our volunteers and the people in the organisation. And again, some of the feedback we got from that was fantastic. The quotes from people who were on the front line delivering services and needed this equipment, and they're saying things like, "This is fantastic. It's just like shopping on Amazon." It was really tremendous to see. across all of those 150 plus projects, every one is a story of people really trying to support other people, to improve their lives, to keep them safe, whatever it is. So, just countless stories of that. And so, if anyone's interested, go and have a look on, our blog site, our podcast and that kind of thing, to hear some of the stories, because it's been quite inspiring. We've also seen, the initial premise of this was we're looking to recruit people who may be on furlough, they may be between contracts, they may even have been made redundant already. And there's been large numbers of people in those situations. But one of the things that we hadn't expected as much, I think, was that we've seen people who are in full-time jobs who also signed up, who said, I can only give a certain amount of time, but I really want to be part of this. I really want to contribute and play my part. So over and above, having full-time jobs, they're putting their own time in evenings and at weekends to make sure they're part of this. So many inspiring examples of what people have done. It's been fantastic. Oh, you're on mute, I think, Johnny.
I am indeed. Classic. It wouldn't be a virtual meeting if I didn't get on mute at some point. And I think that's a perfect time to, first of all, plug the STA and say, look, if you're not already involved, definitely have a look on, on the website, on any number of the media channels that the STA are now on. And yeah, get involved, see if you can be useful. I'm not necessarily from a tech background. I can't code, but you'll find a niche where you can perhaps provide some value. I strongly recommend it. And yeah, I could genuinely
on that point, Jerry, it's a really important point, and thank you for making it. I mean, this was positioned as an initiative for the tech community, but we've got a really broad range of skill sets, and that includes everything, to as well as all the obvious tech skills. It includes marketing and communications, it includes finance and business planning, it includes all sorts of, because basically we are running a full-fledged organization and we do need all those skills.
Absolutely. So yeah, if you've been thinking about getting involved, or if this is the first you heard of it, either way, I encourage you. If you spend a few hours a week, it's definitely worth it. I could sit and ask you questions all night, Alistair, but I think it's only fair that we that we pass it along to all the wonderful people we have join us today. And I'll pass you on to Emma, who should. Well,
yes. Hello.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
We're good.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alistair. It's been a fantastic evening for someone that knows very little about the kind of finance side of everything. It's a fantastic journey, and also just about sharing all the good stuff that's happening and showcasing that's all kind of come out of a not so very good few months. So I think it's important that keeps going. We've got quite a few questions to get through, and if anyone else has more questions that come up off the back of what we're about to ask, feel free to put it in Slido or in the chat. So our first question is actually anonymous, and then I'll go through to a few people that have put their names on. Mm-hmm. So first of all, we've got a question that's, how fundamental do you feel a large marketing spend is? Can a business grow organically based on the quality alone?
Well, I think it depends, which is not the most helpful of answers. I think the key thing, so they talk about the different phases of a startup, and it's all about timing. I think, you can blow a lot of money on marketing when the product's not good enough. And so you can acquire customers in volume, but you can't keep them. And that's a really inefficient way to use your money. So I think it's as a general rule, clearly, if you have marketing funds, it's easier to grow more quickly, but it's also easy to waste a lot of money on marketing. I think it's quite an interesting trend, because there's a movement that I'm sure most people on this call will have heard of, called product-led growth, which is really all about trying to demonstrate virality and getting adoption of product through word of mouth and, as you say, the quality of the product. Interestingly, one division of the company that our business became part of was a company called TeamViewer, which is a German company, and their model was a freemium model, and they were phenomenally successful at that. So they basically did very little marketing, and it was all about being able to get word of mouth adoption of their product. Now, in their case, there was an element of inherent virality in it, because what their product did was it gave you the ability to take remote control of somebody else's computer. So there are lots of products out there that do that now, but it meant that you could take control of somebody else's computer. And so, if, like many of the people on this call, I'm sure, if you are the family tech support person and you need to sort somebody's other computer out somewhere else, trying to do it over the phone is a nightmare. If you can get access to it using a tool like this, then it makes it a lot easier. So there's an inherent element of virality in that, because for any such session, not only is the person who's giving the support seeing it, but the person who's receiving support is seeing it as well. So, there's an inherent level of virality. So everybody knows about what our numbers are right now. So our numbers about, how many people that know about something or have something will tell other people. So they had that natural element of virality. So they grew to 1 billion downloads of their product with, relatively speaking, very little marketing. So it's possible, but it's very dependent on the dynamics of the product. It typically requires some level of virality in order to get that word of mouth spread. So probably don't have time to go into it too much more, but I think it's, you have to really understand how you're going to get that word of mouth to get out there. It doesn't just happen by itself. Oh, I think you're on mute, Emma.
Just furiously typing everything down that you say. So.
Okay.
No, you're so true. But I know a lot of people have tried like spending money on social media marketing, but it totally depends on the product, and if it's just going to get a huge influx of temporary customers, it's not often worth it. So next I'm going to go to Lisa, who I believe is still on the call.
Here she is.
She had a good question. Johnny, can you give her control?
Indeed. Hello, Lisa.
Yeah, we've got.
Yeah. Do you want me to go in there?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Hi, Alistair.
Yes, how are you doing?
Yeah, good to see you. Really well,
Yeah.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up around diversity. And it's going, I guess, back to more about your experience about investment and VC. And you talked about referrals and the importance of networks and being introduced through a network. What would be your, I guess, tips or advice in terms of how we balance that with the diversity agenda? Because I guess I hope you, in terms of your values and things, would appreciate that that can also be a barrier. So I feel that's an important conversation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very true. There does tend to be an element of self-selection or reinforcement that goes along with that. I think getting that warm referral, is you can use your own network to reach other people. It does have to be quite an active process, I think, because, and especially so if you're not already well connected in the space, you really do have to make the effort, and that can be because of all sorts of reasons, whether it's gender or social background or whatever. You don't have a ready-made network of people that can do that for you. So I think again, I would kind of come back to what I was saying earlier, I think, which is, doing your research. So, finding out, who do those people know? Who do they talk to? What are your connections? I mean, nowadays, obviously LinkedIn is around and you can do that much more easily. But you need to be comfortable asking for those referrals. I think, it's still a significant issue. There's no question. I mean, yeah.
What would you say because obviously you have that experience from the investor side, what have you seen in terms of initiatives or actions that maybe investors hopefully would be taking themselves to balance that out? Because there's a balance of power.
There absolutely is. And I don't think it's something that's done that well by many investment firms, to be honest. And I think, I kind of alluded earlier to the fact that, frankly, a lot of investors are quite lazy. They'll just look at what's in front of them. They won't necessarily make an active effort to go and look for, founders from diverse backgrounds or different types of businesses. There is an element of kind of fad and fashion investment as well. So that does make it more difficult for sure. I think there's quite a lot of organizations in the tech sector now that are trying to do something about it. So, you look at the likes of Tech Nation, for example, they're pretty active in that sort of space. A lot of the regional organizations are very much more proactive in that space. We had an example this week, actually, and there's an event that's being run up in Aberdeen, and we thought it would be something that would be good for us to be part of. And credit to them, they said, well, if you want to put somebody forward, that's great, but we'd like it to be a woman. So that's good. Trying to ensure balance in events and panels and that kind of thing. I think it's a lot less common now that you get the all-male panel, but it still exists, and it's still a long way from actually being balanced, I would say.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. So next we've got a question from Andrew. Andrew, would you like to come on and ask your question? You don't have to come on camera, you can just go through the microphone.
Okay. Hi, everyone hear me?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a silly question, unfortunately, but those who
No,
know
sir.
me well won't be
I love
surprised.
this question. I think it's a great question. I've already read it.
So, Alistair, in your startup career, experience in many startups, what's been your biggest Bart Simpson dough moment?
Oh, goodness. I guess it would be in the .com startup that flamed out and died. We were hopelessly optimistic in terms of thinking that the agriculture industry is ripe for disruption, and we're just the people to do it. And we did have some people in the company who were from that kind of a background, but we massively underestimated the resistance to change, the entrenched forces in that industry. We found ourselves in a situation where the market was not ready for what we were trying to do, part of the reason that we just decided in that next company not to do it that way was we had a customer service team of 15 people before we had a customer. That's not very smart. That would probably be the biggest one, I think.
Planning a difficult furrow, then.
Indeed, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So next we've got John Howell. You got a question from John?
Hello there. I was curious that given the COVID-19 epidemic we're going through, is it making it difficult for startups? I mean, is it a bad time to start, or are they actually ideally suited to reacting to the sudden changes that are happening at the moment?
I would say, in principle, they should be better positioned than more established companies in that they should be more agile. I think it depends when you say to start a company, whether you mean actually starting one tomorrow or being in an early stage startup. I think if you're starting one tomorrow, there are all sorts of opportunities that didn't exist 6 months ago. And there are all sorts of companies that are not responding to the change in the market that's happening out there. So you look at something like travel and tourism, for example. If you could come up with a way to help the travel and tourism industry recover from the situation, there's a great opportunity there. So I think if you're literally at that point of starting, then there are opportunities that will be present that weren't present before, and there's probably a lot less competition already in those kind of markets.
Good. Thank you, John. We've got another next, Darren from Nudge, still with us? A good question.
Yeah, still with us. Hi, Alistair. Thanks very much for your Q&A there. Very insightful. I guess my question's around you've had your successes, obviously, and now doing a bit of give back with the Scottish Tech Army. I'm currently just setting up a startup, and I'm quite enticed by the B Corp route, and I just wondered if you had an opinion on them from, I guess, both a startup perspective and an investor perspective.
Well, interesting. So we set the Scottish Tech Army up as a not-for-profit, but we used a more conventional structure. So we used a company limited by guarantee. We did look into the B Corp structure as an option, and it's obviously you've been looking into it. It's kind of a hybrid in a way. I think I haven't had direct experience of operating one, so I can't speak from that basis. I think one thing I would caution is that, if you think you might want to take investment, most investors don't understand what a B Corp is. They've never invested in one, so they don't have any experience. So, you're going to have to do quite a lot of work to explain why it's a good structure for a VC-backed company. They're typically, they're accustomed to investing in conventional, limited company type structures. So I think, you're going to have quite a lot of education to do. Now, if you're not looking to take external investment, then that's not an issue. So I think it's partly dependent. I don't know, is that the plan? Is it to take investment?
Yes, at some point, I guess part of my feeling was that there's a growing movement around, ESG type investment vehicles as well. I just thought that might align quite nicely with that sort of investment method.
Yeah, well, as I say, we set up using a company limited by guarantee structure, which has no shareholders, and I would say, for organisations that are not charities, that are not for profits, that's the most common structure I would say in the UK. There's a lot of social enterprises that have been set up using that kind of a structure. So it's a bit of it's a more well-known animal in that sense. I haven't done enough research to say, what might the unique advantages of a B Corp structure be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thanks. Just trying to stress thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. So we're going to take just a couple more questions. So if we don't get to your questions, then perhaps is there a way that Alistair, you could be contacted, or the best way to?
Yep, absolutely. So Alistair at scottishtecharmy.org is probably the best way.
Very good. So Johnny, you can take that down.
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat, and then I'll probably put it in an email after the event as well. You'll receive a feedback email immediately afterwards from the main Startup Brain organization, and then you'll receive one from me maybe a day or two afterwards. Genuinely, we'd love to have any real feedback. What went good about the event? What went bad about the event? How we can do better? Bring the community together more. Feel free to insult my quarantine haircut. Whatever you want to do. Send the feedback through, and we appreciate it. Back to you, Emma.
So well played, Emma. I would just point out, quite early on in lockdown, I was listening to a podcast, again, on my daily hour of exercise, an interview with Mark Cuban, who many of you may have heard of as a well-known entrepreneur and investor in the States. And he came up with the expression that said, in order to accelerate, you have to delegate. So that's been part of the mantra for us in the Scottish Tech Army. So well handed off to Johnny there.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, so next we've got Al, and I assume is it Alan Stevenson, perhaps?
It is, yeah.
Here we go.
So, hey Alistair, so you mentioned fad and fashion, and I just wondered, in Scotland, do we tend to follow the US or a global thing, or are there any particular areas that are of interest to Scottish, VCs at the moment?
So I think the landscape in Scotland for investment is pretty heavily concentrated in two spaces, so the software and the life sciences space. I think it's a lot harder for companies in Scotland who are, hardware-based companies, for example, to raise investment. So I think there's certain areas that Scottish investors are comfortable with, or are used to investing in. The profiles of those two sectors are different. I don't think you tend to see what you might call the irrational exuberance that you see for both good and ill in the States. It's the national stereotype obviously is a bit more canny than that, but I think it's true. So I think that there's less evidence of that, I would say, in Scotland. It's probably also because the number of companies is smaller, so you don't tend to get a whole host of companies starting up in a certain space. So if you take the obvious things like AI or blockchain, new technology type investments, we do have examples of those companies. We've got some very good examples of those kind of companies in Scotland, but there's not enough for an investor to say, right, I'm only going to focus on those if they're looking just in the Scottish market. So I think it is still reasonably broad. But we just don't have the volume that they have in the States, for example, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So lastly, we've got a question from Chris Conrad. Are you still with us?
Hey, I'm still here. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me or not. Can you?
Yeah,
we can.
Great accent.
Okay. Hi, Alistair.
These parts, are you, boy?
No. Canada, though, don't worry. Not American. No fear.
I recognize that. Don't worry, I did get that bit right.
That's too funny. Yeah, so I was kind of curious. So for people like myself who don't have a tech background, but we have, maybe a traditional engineering background, operational background, that kind of thing, how do you recommend us building a network to kind of get to know people that we can begin to work with and develop relationships?
You mean to get into the sort of software and tech scene, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So more or less, so I'm kind of working on an idea right now, and focus to actually implement it would need like a tech framework around it. So how do you build those relationships coming from a different background?
Sure. Well, that's obviously especially hard at the moment because, events like this, you would normally, there'd be a networking session before or after, and you could kind of go and try and meet some people.
We're still trying to figure out how to do that. We still need to find a way, but we'll roll for now.
Indeed, absolutely. Whatever the donut call equivalent of a Zoom meeting is. Yeah, I think, there are quite a lot of, there are probably a surfeit of meetup groups. And, you can spend a lot of time going around those different groups, and it can be quite hard to meet people. I think, you do have to persevere with that. It's a bit of a slog sometimes, but I think you do have to do that. Depending on which area of technology you think you want to get into, there may well be specific meetup groups, and I'm sure you looked into them already. I think, it's something which I would say traditionally in Scotland, a lot of the groups have been very regional. So it's interesting that, the two chapters of Startup Grind in Edinburgh, they do collaborate and they do try and get the communities to mix with each other. But certainly a lot of the physical meetup groups have been very regionally based. I don't know, where are you based, Chris?
Sorry, can you hear me again?
We got you.
I'm just based in Glasgow right now.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Great city.
Yeah. So yeah, Glasgow's got a reasonably thriving ecosystem, but it does tend to be quite regionalised. So I don't know if in Glasgow, the particular area you're interested in already has a group like that. It's one of the things that has been interesting again about the Scottish Tech Army experience is that because by nature it's remote, it's all virtual. There is quite a good spread of people from different backgrounds and in different parts of the country. I think if from what sounds like what you're saying, you're looking for somebody who's got that kind of experience. I think it's definitely worth pursuing that route and trying to find, if you like, a co-founder who's got that skill set that is going to be so important to building the business. I don't know if you have any already working with you on it. The journey of a solo founder is pretty tough.
No, ideally that won't be the case.
Yeah. But, so at the moment it's just you, is it?
Yeah, and a couple guys from back in Canada, but it's,
Yeah. So yeah, I think trying to find somebody with that sort of skill set is definitely a good investment of your time. And it's pretty much all going to have to be obviously online at the moment. So yeah, there's not an easy way, I'm afraid. I don't know if you want to shout out on this call what it is you're looking for. You never know, there might be somebody in the audience who has just exactly the right skill set.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to describe, but if anyone wants to connect,
you're going to have to work on that.
That's the elevator pitch needed right there.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't really planning on actually chatting. I didn't think I'd be called out there, but I can put my email in the description if anyone.
Yeah, please do. Sorry to drag you into the limelight, Chris. We encourage a bit of community spirit. It's great to have you along. I
was going to say I'm in my pajamas on my bed, so not dressed to be seen.
Dressed to impress.
No, definitely not.
No, it's a great question, and it's something that people are facing more and more just with changing careers and going to more technical roles. So there's definitely lots of communities, you know, in Glasgow we've had various speakers from different kind of, I guess, similar to Startup Grind, but you know, more tech background. So I'd say keep looking, and you know, practice your elevator pitch and pop your email down.
Feel free
And there's
to drop
definitely
me a
loads of
message.
people that will be able to help. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, everyone. Thank you.
Excellent. As I say, Trish, drop any of us a message as well, and we'll see what we can do to help promote you across the ecosystem as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, first of all, to Alistair for joining us this evening. It's been, I've thoroughly enjoyed this one. It's really enjoyed the event. I hope all you who are with us right now, you've enjoyed it as well. Thank you to Emma for facilitating the Q&A, for running everything in the background, making sure everything runs smoothly. And yeah, one final shout out. I'm going to drop a link into the chat, but we're back next week. Perhaps not we directly as Glasgow, but Startup Grind Edinburgh are back next week. Welcome Gavin Neat, who with an event about championing inclusivity with tech. So we're along the same themes. Different entrepreneur with a lot of different and interesting stories. So if you're interested in coming along, I've just dropped the link in the chat, and yeah, we'd love to see you there. And yeah, thank you everybody so much for coming along, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, folks.
Bye-bye.